Welcome back, everyone, to Radio Free Market. I'm your guest host for today in place of Michael McKay. I'm Zoe Russell. This is a live show. If you're wanting to call in, just call us at 1-800-313-9443. With me is Dr. Hunt Tooley, and we're just discussing the history of inflation. Let's travel back in time to 14th century Europe. Murray Rothbard, a great Austrian economic scholar, pointed out that rather than a linear and continuous progression in human development from the 11th century onward, as is generally believed, there was a period in Europe from around 1300 to the mid-1500s marked by a severe drop in population and an economic decline. And this is normally blamed on the Black Plague, but Rothbard says we've got to understand what caused the lower living standards that allowed the plague to flourish in the first place. Can you tell us what caused these lower living standards across Europe in the 14th century?
Well, Zoe, part of what was going on there was that this is the precise period in which the modern state in its modern form began to rise, and what had been in place previously was a much more localized kind of rule across Europe, whether it was independent towns with their city patriciates or senates or councils, or on the land feudal nobles who were lords of their own castle and so forth. And what happened was that in conjunction with the Crusades, which began about 1100 or so, and then various other influences, that this state came to the fore, and the state began to almost immediately to have to manipulate wealth into its own coffers so that it could, in fact, conquer these local authorities like the cities and the nobles and so forth. So there's a big struggle there, and that's part of the economic decline as more wealth of large populations began to make their way into the hands of this you might say authority, but you might say it's just a kind of corporate entity that came out of nowhere. It's as if we decided today that there would be a club, and suddenly that club was the leader of everything. So it's the creation of the state, really, and the formation of the state that we get a lot of these disjunctions, and a lot of the monetary and therefore and the currency kinds of issues too. Although we don't have paper currency until a little bit later, we do have a lot of you might say messing around with the coinage and with other forms of money.
So I guess we can move on from there. That's sort of the point where kings would take over the minting of coins. Let's move on to one of the great tales in inflationary history. Can you tell us what happened during King Henry VIII's reign in England, also called the Great Debasement?
Sure, that's an interesting episode. The Henry VIII was, along with a number of other princes in Europe, what we historians call a new monarch, and these were the monarchs who really first were able to marshal this central authority and assert their authority over these older local allegiances. And all these new monarchs contrived to, as I say, this is an illustration of my description of the rise of the state. I mean, they contrived to get the money of people into the state's coffers, and Henry VIII did this in a number of ways. And most people have an idea that they understand that Henry VIII was a very aggressive, acquisitive, centralized monarch, and he took over the Church of England, and he redefined all kinds of things, and he conquered a piece of Ireland and took over all the Catholic churches, monasteries, etc., etc. But another way that he was able to fill the coffers of his growing state with its growing bureaucracy and growing military forces was to inflate the currency, but here through coinage debasement. And what he did, pure and simple, was to call on the abilities of those much maligned alchemists. And here they weren't looking for a sort of key to everlasting life. He just used their chemical and metallurgical skills to literally debase the currency. They would just bring the gold and silver pieces in, and as they cycle through and replace those with much debased, alloys that had mostly much cheaper metals in those. So there was a great debasement. This did create inflation because suddenly there were more coins to be put out, and so as there were more coins, of course, as the currency depreciated and was debased, then each coin was actually worth less. So this is a kind of a startling way to think about an early inflation in European history, because you don't even need paper money for this to happen if the coinage is debased. Previous to this, there have been a lot of coin clipping and that sort of thing, but there's only so far you can go when you're shaving the edges off coins to create more coins. People notice pretty soon that their coins are smaller than they were. With the debasement, people were supposed to sort of believe this, and after a while it became this kind of open fiction. But the currency was inflated, and therefore this basic process of legal plunder that, as Bastiat would call this, and many other kinds of state-sanctioned money manipulation and wealth manipulation, this kind of legal plunder then led to Henry VIII being much richer, and England being much richer, and being able to finance all those fleets that established naval predominance and beat eventually later on beat the Armada at sea, and then went off and got colonies, etc., etc.
Wow.
So that's the story of the Great Debasement. There's many other stories of these new monarchs manipulating coinage, manipulating wealth in every kind of way that we can think of, really, in their circumstances. And it's also interesting, Zoe, if I can just continue for a second on this episode, it's also interesting that at this moment in European history, for about 100 years before Henry VIII, modern banking had really had its birth, and it's in this realm of history that the government first begins to delve into the banking business, so that banks, which originally were just basically storehouses for commodities of gold and silver, in other words, the coins were basically commodities. In these cases, governments began to just go to these banks and say, well, we're going to take a third of this gold here. The bankers would say, well, it's not ours to give, we're just storing it. And the governments would say, it's okay, we'll make it a non-fraudulent thing for you to say that we will simply, that you can simply take people's money and only have the reserves, only have gold and silver enough to cover a part of it. So this is also, in the earliest stages of modern banking, there's also the birth of fractional reserve banking, which, of course, is one of the most serious modern problems of inflationary legal plunder, because the inflation of credit also acts as the inflation of money does.
So it's a sense of government-mandated fraud, as long as
certainly. Government-backed fraud, government-enabled fraud, sure.
I want to point out before we go on, though complicated by these banking practices and paper money, the method of inflation practiced by government after government afterwards is a mirror image of what King Henry did to his people's coins. Would you agree with that?
I think that's right. So that's a good way to put it. I mean, in our I'm teaching a class at the Mises Academy at this moment, and one thing that happens in the class is that as we look at inflation after inflation from this period, from Henry VIII all the way to the present, current events, that the methods of governments in creating these inflations, and also in dealing with them and talking about them and covering them over and blaming the inflation on somebody else. It's almost, I mean, it's interesting, but it has this almost monotonous quality to it in that it all looks the same. We covered a recent op-ed piece the other night that we'd read for the class, and the writer said, well, this is an amazing thing in Argentina. They're using these unorthodox methods of wage and price controls to keep the price down, even though they continue to lower the discount rate for credit. And so that means they're inflating, but then they intervene in the market to make it appear, they think, so that there is no inflation by means of wage and price controls. And, of course, this is the oldest trick in the book. Henry VIII did this, too.
Right. So let's see. When the public fights a tax increase and nobody wants to lend their savings to the king, that's when the devious partnership between bankers and politicians, also known as the central bank, comes about. It's a hidden tax through inflation.
Yeah, I think so. I think that, and that develops over really over a century. I mean, I think one thing that happened was that you do get the rise of these central banks, and this is an important part of the story.
Well, let me cut you off right there.
Very good. Yeah,
we'll go out to break, but we'll be right back with Radio Free Market and Dr. Hunt Tooley.